everyone. Yep, so I'm Chris. Thank you, Dominic, for introducing me. And I'm going to talk about work that I do in concert with this group of scientists that are largely, but not entirely, funded and put together by the SASIP project, which is part of ESRI that focuses on sea ice modeling. And we've got websites, so I have a personal website there if you're curious about what I do. And then we have a group website, polaroceans.com, that tells you more about these people. So the question here is, why are we doing what we're doing? Why is Schmidt Futures dumping millions of dollars into studying sea ice? And I'll try to illustrate, our rationale for existing. And I'll explain to you who my group is and what SASIP does, and then go through a couple key topics that we're working on, particularly in my work package, about how sea ice as a fractured material is relevant for climate modeling. So that's most of us in what we call now the antipodal polar oceanography group. Now that I've moved to Auckland, we cross the hemispheres. It used to be the polar oceanography group at Brown. Now we're in both places. So we've started to build out a team in Auckland. So we have a couple postdocs that'll be joining us here in Cambridge, and then a series of other postdocs, graduate students, undergraduate researchers. There's about 12 of us. And we're extremely distributed, so it's not just me, it's everyone else too. We currently sit in 5 continents. Yeah. So we're missing South America, but we've got the rest covered, from New Zealand to the US, South Africa, and Europe, and Asia. And the general founding principle behind SASIP, which is one of the Schmidt Futures project, one of the best 3 projects, is that we're trying to improve polar prediction, so climate model predictions of polar science, the polar climate. And that's what SASIP does. So we have a hypothesis that the reason, I'll try to illustrate the reason, but it has to do with sea ice. So problems with the modeling and interaction of sea ice with the climate system, and that's what we're building as a large group. So there are 6 of us as PIs. Pierre and Paul is the lead PI, and there's the group of us. Myself and Veronique are here this week. I think the rest are at home, but generally we're working on a lot of different things related to building a new sea ice model, doing some physics, ice-ocean interactions, and sea ice rheological developments, and what my group focuses on is this. So the interactions between sea ice and the ocean, a little bit the atmosphere as well. So I'll go in a little bit of a weird direction and try and explain to you why sea ice is so important, and why sea ice as a fractal material is so important, by not thinking about sea ice at all, and instead thinking about ecology. But before we get there, I'll just try and explain to you what sea ice is. So sea ice is frozen seawater, and it covers a shockingly large percentage of the globe, especially if you're a person who doesn't live near sea ice, which most of us are. It's about 9 or 10% of the surface of the planet is covered by frozen seawater at some point during the year. So that's 35 million square kilometers or more, and the total surface area is bigger than the North American continent and Europe together. And there's sea ice in 2 places. The Arctic is the northern component, and the Antarctic. And they're very different. They have different seasonal cycles, they have different physical properties, everything's different about them, up to a certain extent. And I won't go into too much detail about that. But one of the motivating questions for a lot of scientists, and especially those of us focused in the Arctic, is plots or videos like you see here, which is looking at satellite-derived sea ice age since about 19, or in this case, from about 2000. And that white material is old ice, so ice that would persist over multiple years. And you'll notice that over time, this old ice is disappearing. So you might have heard that sea ice is going away. In terms of its areal extent, it's declined by about 15% on an annual average since 1978. The thickness and the age of the sea ice, the thickness of the ice, has declined by about 50 or 60%, and there's almost none of this old sea ice left. So ice that grows in the Arctic melts in the subsequent summer, or maybe lasts a full year, and that's about it. So massive declines in the overall mass of sea ice, in addition to its aerial coverage. And so the reason we care about it is not just because it's going away, but because it has profound consequences for Earth's energy balance and climate. So this is us in West Greenland in 2019, and you can see me, that's my shadow down there, and we're crossing a sea ice edge. And the most important thing to ever worry about, ever think about, when you're thinking about cryospheric systems or sea ice, is that it reflects the sun. So the albedo, or the reflectivity of the sea ice surface to sunlight, can be as high as 93% or 95%, which is 10 or more times larger than the albedo of open water. So when you remove sea ice, you open the ocean to sunlight and can heat it. And this is the primary reason why, for example, the Arctic warms 3 or 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. So getting back to this, there was a pretty remarkable discovery that was made about 10 years ago. I'll explain in a second why it wasn't as remarkable as we might have once thought. But there was an oceanographic cruise in an area of the Arctic Ocean, one of the peripheral seas, and they were sampling for biology. So they were looking at ecological activity, and they measured a massive, what they called massive, phytoplankton bloom. So high levels, the colors here are particular organic carbon. They're taken during a ship-based transect, and that's with depth, and just trust me, those red colors are very high. So we have high levels of phytoplankton carbon underneath or in the ocean, and the integrated chlorophyll concentrations were higher than basically had ever been recorded anywhere else. That's cool. But what actually made this newsworthy was it took place completely under ice. So there was 100% sea ice concentration. The ice was over a meter thick, and yet we had this massive growth of phytoplankton. So they're swimming little critters that photosynthesize. And what we talked about just before is that sea ice is reflective, right? So the thing I just said is the whole reason we care about sea ice is it reflects the sun. And here we have a massive outgrowth of photosynthetic critters living underneath something that's purportedly blocking sunlight. So what gives there? And since that discovery was reported in 2011, there's been a strong outgrowth of interest in understanding these under ice ecosystems. So I've contributed a part to this, but many other people have. And this has led to the development of this sort of narrative for under ice ecology in the Arctic. So the predominant reason that folks have implicated climate change, I should step back and say the predominant reason these things are suspected to occur in the Arctic has to do with what you can see up at the top, which are melt ponds. So sea ice has a snow layer on top of it. That snow melts in the summer, and that collects in these topographic low regions, and that reduces the reflectivity of the surface to sunlight. So whereas you might have 90% of the sunlight reflected to space or absorbed in the ice, when there's no pond, you might only get 35% of it that's not transmitted to the upper ocean. And so in the Anthropocene, we've seen 2 things happen. First, that this ponding, the melting of the surface of the sea ice, is occurring closer to the peak of the solar cycle, so in June or July. And the ice is getting thinner, so the sunlight that gets to the surface is not absorbing inside the sea ice anymore, so you get a lot more solar radiance in the ice. And so interpreting this story or using this story, we've developed a number of different, or written a number of different papers on how this is an emergent phenomenon in the Arctic. So over the past 30 years or so, driven entirely by anthropogenic global warming and changes to sea ice, there's a massive increase in the preponderance of these blooms in the summertime Arctic. They weren't happening 30 years ago, and they're happening now. There's evidence for this not just in our modeling and observational studies, but in observations of other chemical proxies, like atmospheric iodine, which is a byproduct of photosynthesis, especially photosynthesis in the upper ocean. And so in the past 40 years or so, there's been a massive increase in the levels of atmospheric iodine recorded in Greenland ice cores, which haven't had any other synchronous increases in, say, anthropogenic sources. And so the blame goes fully to changes to the under ice ecology. So this is our recipe, right, for under ice ecological activity. We've got a seasonal surface change that's intrinsic to the behavior of sea ice, particularly in the Arctic. You've got a background level of climate change, so thinning sea ice, changes to the time at which the surface starts to pond, and then you get these emergent ecological features. Seems sensible. I work in the southern hemisphere now, and so the natural question is, well, what's going on in Antarctica? And the answer, given this story, is, well, there's not actually ponding on Antarctic sea ice. This has to do with the formation mechanism of the ice there. Happy to take questions on why that is, but generally there's no surface ponding. It's also actually not an anthropogenic signal in overall sea ice extent or thickness in Antarctica. And this again has to do with the way that sea ice forms there. So over the past 40 years, we've seen maybe a slight increase or a slight decrease, but generally not really much of a trend in the coverage. So we have seen changes in the variability. And so if we follow the story in the Arctic, well, there's not going to be blooms in Antarctica. So that's fair. So the question we want to ask, or we've been asking, is are we actually sure about this? And one of the primary lines of evidence comes from remote sensing data, which looks at the relationship between the retreat of sea ice and the availability or the growth of chlorophyll at the surface. So chlorophyll A measurements, which is basically green pigments that you can send from satellite, and you can correlate when you have increases in chlorophyll to when you have decreases in sea ice coverage. In the Arctic, there's a number of studies that have pointed out that these chlorophyll increases are strongly correlated with changes to sea ice. The same thing is true in Antarctica. What this suggests is that the nutrients required to see these kind of blooms are there in both hemispheres, and that all it takes is increases in light to cause blooms, which are induced by the change in sea ice. And this kind of evidence was marshaled in favor of why we should experience these blooms in the Arctic, because the nutrients are there, and all you need is sunlight. A little funny thing we discovered by spending a bit more time with this Arctic problem is that it turns out these blooms weren't just discovered in 2011. They didn't just pop out in 2010. They were observed dating back to the first time anyone ever did an overwinter with biological sampling in the Arctic. This was in the International Polar Year Project, which was a drifting ice camp near the North Pole in 1957 through 1958. And they observed a massive, quote-unquote, phytoplankton bloom underneath super thick ice. And this didn't really garner any sort of understanding or attention in recent years. And the reason was because it was buried in a scientific report that was never digitized and was hard to read. And if you were interested in this kind of physics and these biological problems, you might have read it and not thought anything of it. They just simply stated they observed chlorophyll underneath the ice, and that was it. And so we've since revised our estimates of how much photosynthetic life there is under the ice to say maybe it's about 2 million square kilometers of the Arctic ice cover. A significant fraction in summer months was permitting these kind of biological events. And the increase has been a factor of maybe 50% since the satellite period began. This was so long. And so the fact that it doesn't seem to be a thing about the surface change.
Oh yeah, I was just going to ask, how much light do we think actually gets through the ice to support these blooms?
Yeah, it's not as much as you might think. So culture experiments require very, very low light levels. If you think about it, these kind of these kind of photosynthetic organisms have to make it through a winter, right? So somehow they're adapted to extremely low light levels, and they go into some hibernation, or a very small amount of the population survives. But if you do culture experiments, like if you go and take water samples in, say, the Ross Sea, which colleagues of mine do, and you expose them from darkness to extremely low light levels, 1/100th of the solar radiance in summer, let's say, they'll bloom. They're very, very responsive to light, as long as they have required nutrients. Yeah, it's not very high, not very much light. So this combination has led us to try and hunt for this thing happening in the Southern Ocean. I should say still, through sea ice, through let's say a meter of sea ice with no pond on top, there's not enough solar radiance to give rise to these blooms, because you need a full water column at this kind of level. So it's still a bit more, but it's not very much. So now we're increasingly unsure about whether these things are just confined to the Arctic and whether they are driven by things like anthropogenic warming primarily. And so we started thinking about how we could sample underneath sea ice in both hemispheres and predominantly Antarctica. And we use this platform of autonomous buoys. They're called Argo floats. If you haven't run into them before, they've basically ushered in a massive overhaul in how we understand the world's ocean. And there are these autonomous floats that drift under the ocean. They make measurements every 10 days. They go down to about 4,000 or 2,000 meters. They're sampling temperature and salinity. And they pop up and they transmit that out to a satellite. In Antarctica, or underneath sea ice, the problem's a lot harder. Instead of 4,000 floats, there's only about 50 of them, at least that have been deployed, that combine both measurements under ice. So there's a problem with these floats. They come up and they hit the top of the float against an area of sea ice, which is a solid. They'll break. So you can't have You can't deploy these floats underneath the ice unless they have special ice sensing algorithms. And very few of them also sample things like biological behavior, but have a scatterometer that measures the particulate in carbon or backscatter. So there's 50 of them, though, that have ever been deployed, that have sampled under sea ice, and that have actually made measurements of biology. And so out of 2.5 million, 3 million dives that have taken place since the 1990s, just under 2,000 of them measured under the sea ice in the southern hemisphere and measured biology. And we've segmented those nearly 2,000 samples into 2,000 dives into 77 discrete time series of measurements. So these are repeated measurements under ice that are measuring the biology. You're going to see most of them here. So this is sea ice in Antarctica from 2014 to present. The first one of these floats was deployed in 2014. And if you look at these as independent measurements of under ice ecology, almost every single one of them shows increases in the phytoplankton stock before sea ice goes away. Underneath ice, you have increases in photosynthesis before the retreat of ice. And a full third of them or so have what we would say constitutes an under ice bloom. So these are the similar levels to what are recorded in the Arctic. Almost all of these bloom events, there's 23 of them, take place in November. So this is before sea ice is retreating, when sea ice is near its maximal extent, and when the solar cycle isn't necessarily at its peak. Remember this being in the southern hemisphere, or opposite in the northern hemisphere. This is like having these in May in the Arctic. And so we combine this observation with some other modeling data. And the upshot of this is just to say that the conditions supportive of under ice ecology are widespread in the Southern Ocean. Across a series of different climate models contributing to the 6th CMIP, so that's the 6th coupled monitoring comparison project, the average light conditions that are required for these kind of blooms take place in something like 3 to 11 million square kilometers of the under ice regions of the Arctic, which occupy up to about 15 million square kilometers. And that's more than we see in the Arctic. So not only are these things happening here, but they're happening more than they're in the Arctic. And so something about the story that we're telling ourselves about Arctic under ice ecology is incorrect. The question is, why? The answer is that sea ice looks nothing like the videos that you see of sea ice. Sea ice is a solid material, right? It's not a fluid. It behaves as a composite of individual solid pieces, which are called flows. So you can see on the left, this is Antarctic sea ice. This is somewhere, I think, in the Weddell Sea. And this is an icebreaker. It's 100 meters long, and it's got all these pieces around it. The overall aerial coverage, say, ignoring that big opening, is probably 90%. So that's the fraction that's covered by ice. But it's highly segmented by these little openings. And one of the revealing papers on this was a cruise that took place in 2015 called the N-Ice Expedition. This is Svalbard. It's an island in northern, doesn't belong to anyone, but it's in the North Atlantic. And this is all sea ice. And this cruise drifted or broke through ice that was completely ice. Well, about 97 or 98% compact. And they measured a bloom just like the one that had been observed in 2011. And the rationale was light gets around these cracks. So this is, I took this morning, an image from MODIS. It's an optical sensor, a satellite optical sensor of the place where they observed this bloom. So here we have this bright white sea ice. But around the edges of the sea ice are enough openings to permit the amount of photosynthetically available radiation to get through that could see these blooms. So all of this ecological activity, well, I should just say that this presents this new kind of story for under ice ecology. So you can get the light required to promote these big under ice ecological events, which might contribute, say, to carbon sequestration through the ice. That seems to be emerging in response to climate change. And that could occupy 1 or 2 million square kilometers of the Arctic, but very little of the Antarctic. But around the sea ice, in highly compact ice zones, you're likely to have more of it in the Arctic and a ton of it in Antarctica. So likely the driving factor is not anthropogenic warming, but we just got lucky to see it in 2011. And now we see it everywhere. So, to explain why I'm here, and why I'm here as a leader of this work package and this SASIP, is that obviously, as you can imagine, the sea ice models we use to represent, say, fractal behavior in climate models represent that very well. And that's just, of course, incorrect. So climate models don't represent geometric properties of sea ice, these small openings, the flow behavior at any scale, in any way. They don't do it. And so if you're interested in questions of ecology, you're not going to get the requisite variability that's needed to see these kind of blooms, even if you have an ecological model. And there's a whole host of other reasons why this is a real problem. And I'll get into some of them now. So we're going to move on to thinking a bit about sea ice and ocean modeling and talk about what it is we're trying to fix as a group with sea ice and ocean models and what's going wrong. And one of the biggest questions we face, if any of you want to go see the I&I meeting that's taking place across the hall or across the lawn, plots like this are showing up quite a bit, or will be showing up quite a bit. And there's a main problem in the sea ice world, the climate modeling world, which is the sea ice sensitivity problem. So namely that, well, in 2007, there was this very sort of well-known study for us about the inability of sea ice models to accurately predict sea ice loss. So the reddish thing is the observation, and this is from the third couple model under comparison project. We've got a bunch of different models, and none of them lost enough sea ice. A few years later, in the fifth couple model under comparison, this seemed to be better. This was a major improvement that we sort of patted ourselves on the back. Huge differences, or huge improvements in the models had taken place between those two generations, and so it seemed like things were improving. And this paper, which was by Erica Rosenblum, who's a member of my group now, explained that this improvement was illusory. In fact, this improvement was just an emblem of a problem that's existed in the climate modeling community since at least the 80s, which is that the models that, so here is these models that are plotted here. The x-axis is the global warming trend, the y-axis is the sea ice trend. These are the models, and here's the observation. The only models that accurately get the loss of sea ice, changes to sea ice cover, are the ones that overwarm. They're 2 or 3 degrees too hot. The only models that get the global mean temperature right don't remove any sea ice. So we have a problem, which is that the ratio between sea ice loss and warming is incorrect in these models. We expanded on this in a paper last year, which is looking at all these different sources of uncertainty in climate models having to do with, say, climate or internal variability, as well as differences between the model physics in the set of models contributing to the sixth CMIP. Across both of these, so we're looking at 17 different ensembles, so hundreds and hundreds of different integrations of present climate, none of them accurately reproduce the sensitivity to warming in any month. So this isn't just a sort of minimum thing, it's not just an annual thing, it's every month, every model, including all modes of types of inherent uncertainty. And the problem gets worse. It's not just this sensitivity problem, which is a two-dimensional problem at the surface, but it's also the oceans. So this is just an example of one of many of instances in which inappropriate sea ice evolution, or sea ice and ocean coupling, has led to problems in ocean modeling. So this here is 2 different profiles of salinity. So the depth of the ocean, this is the salinity from an ice campaign that took place in 1975, a year-long ice campaign called Ajax. And then this is from autonomous or ice-tethered profilers that stick in the ice and move around during the 2000s. And so what you can see is something we know has happened, which is that the surface of the Arctic Ocean is freshened. There's a few reasons for that. One of them is sea ice melting. One of them is river changes. One of them is the spin-up of the gyre circulation in the Baltic Sea. Models don't do that. So these dashed lines are the average of those observations. The models tend to just sort of float along happily, slightly freshening everywhere. So despite the fact that you actually integrated the changes over time down to the depth of the ocean, we find that the total input of new fresh water in the models matches the observation. The places that it goes in the models are wrong. It's going too deep, and it's not changing over time. So this is a fairly complex plot, but in general, what you have to see is that back in time, models and observations mix most of the water down to the correct depth. So in this case, it's 90% of the input fresh water, about 25 meters. Models keep doing this now, but in observations, fresh water's coming closer to the surface. So okay, explaining to you that models are doing a lot of things wrong. And I'm showing you that the fact that sea ice is a non-continuum can give rise to really interesting and emergent, or not even emergent, just ecological phenomena. This is a sea ice model that's used in a coupled model, standard coupled model. This looks like every other, for the most part, sea ice model on high and low resolution. This is a degree simulation from the loom 3 sea ice model. It's the European model. And it looks good if you don't spend much time on the sea ice or worrying about the sea ice. It's a continuum, and it's a viscous plastic continuum that's effectively smooth and moves with the atmosphere and the ocean. This is the heat flux of the ice. So this is the backbone of every single model in CMIP 6. Every one of them. They all use this kind of rheology, without exception. But sea ice doesn't look like that at all. This is RGPS data, so this is satellite-borne data of fracture patterns in the ice. What you're seeing is these large brittle fractures that are spanning thousands of kilometers. They're opening on a scale of several days and closing on a scale of several days. They have this full characteristic where they can be quite small and quite large. This is a fairly coarse-grained, observation. But they have this multifractal behavior across length and time scales. That's what sea ice does. It's a composite. It's not just at these larger length scales, though. This is the image I showed you before, a small floe surrounding the Nathaniel Palmer. But this is a notice image, so an optical image of the Bering Strait. You can see that sea ice is comprised of pieces. It's a composite material, it's a brittle material that fractures, and it has these pieces called flows, and these flows span the range of scales from meters to tens of kilometers. How am I doing for time?
Yeah, pretty good. We've got 20 minutes, okay. 15, 20 minutes left.
Cool. So a thing we've been focusing on my group is the imprint of this variability in sea ice fragmentation on the upper ocean. So this is an example of a simulation where you take a very high resolution model. It's a general circulation model called the MIT GCM, and you cover it with ice on one end, and you melt it from above. This gets preferentially heated, this doesn't, so you form gradients in the upper ocean that are unstable for geostrophic instability and create eddies. The rectified impact of this can be seen in an experiment like this. So here we have one big piece of ice, and here we have a bunch of small pieces of ice. They have the same area and volume. This one takes way longer to melt than this one. This is the time it takes to melt the sea ice, the total volume curve, and you can see it varies by several months as a function of the geometry. It's nothing to do with sea ice physical changes, nothing to do with forcing changes. It has everything to do with whether or not you have small or large flows. And something Arnold Piccolo just has been looking at is how to characterize these dynamics with an eye towards parameterizing them in climate models. So this is, again, a similar simulation to what I showed you before, but now instead of heating from above, we're cooling it. So this edge of the sea ice is not moving. You're just freezing ice in place here. And these eddies are still generated, because now when you freeze ice, you input salt to the upper ocean because it's rejected from the freezing ice, and that gives rise to the same sort of geostrophic instability and mixing. And Anna can talk a little bit more about her work if you're curious. But in general, what we find is that from this common model scale, we have what can be considered a classic hallmark of sub-mesoscale eddies. So you have this splitting, we have an upscale transfer of energy, or an inverse energy cascade, and a forward entropy cascade. So you've got these filaments that form, and the energy in these eddies grows in time. So we can actually track the evolution and parameterize the evolution of these eddies in terms of their length scale against observation. And from a climate model, all of this sort of growth of eddies, these eddies moving heat or salinity in and out of the ice edge is spontaneous. It doesn't exist. You don't have representations of this geometry of these edges that would be required to parameterize this. That's part of what we're trying to tackle with SASIP. So if we believe that sea ice geometric features affect the ocean by causing it to create these eddies or create upper ocean variability, we kind of have to consider two of these different horizontal scales. The first one is the deformation radius, the Rossby radius of deformation, which tells you the preferential length scales of ocean variability or ocean eddies. In the Arctic, this is a kilometer, let's say. It can be smaller, it can larger. And then climate models also have a grid scale. And that grid scale is telling you the ability you have to resolve edges or these sort of fractal or fracture features in the ice that can give rise to these kind of moments of ocean variability. And something we worked on recently is trying to figure out just how big the pieces of ice are. So I'll skip over how we do this. We'll use alphametric processing. So we use radar altimeters and laser altimeters, spaceborne altimeters that can be used to measure the size of pieces of ice. And in the Arctic, a typical flow scale is about 5 kilometers, give or take. So that means sea ice is a big problem for us as climate modelers. Flows range from 10 meters to 10 kilometers. So we've got kilometer scale variability in the pieces that make up the sea ice flow mosaic. Those are larger than the scales of ocean variability that give rise to differences in the resolved physics. And it's way smaller than the grid scales that are being run in climate models, particularly the climate models that are making projections about future climate and used in sort of IPCC scenarios. You might remember this. If you have a global climate model, it's got no representation of this whatsoever. There's nothing about sea ice geometry at any scale. Don't produce sea ice geometric variations. And so something we've been working on recently is trying to find a way to parameterize the effect of sea ice geometry on resolved ocean and atmospheric motions. And we call this something called the polar tempest. And you'll see why in a second. So this is a diagram of a standard two-dimensional turbulent cascade. You have a scale of forcing here, 1. There's a forward entropy cascade down to the grid scale, dissipation here, forcing is separate from the dissipation, and there's an inverse energy cascade. Energy is dissipated generally in contact with boundaries of your domain. When you get sea ice has this full multifractal distribution of cracks, flows, and so your forcing is no longer isolated from either side of the inertial range in this cascade. So we have big issues. And this is why we have a major problem in continuous sea ice models, which is that they have to be obscuring the impact of these sort of subgrid scale variability, the spontaneous mixing. To understand why, here's a little diagram of the sun. When you have sea ice, you might have no sunlight going through the ocean, but when you have open water, you have lots of it. The climate model can sustain sea ice concentration, so it's got a continuum representation of the sea ice. It's got a fraction of every grid cell because they're a degree that's covered by ice. But an ocean model doesn't have anything other than temperature or salinity or momentum. So to get at a forcing term for the temperature or salinity or momentum, you have to average the sea ice flux and the ocean flux, open water flux. And those can differ by orders of magnitude. So this implies some crazy mixing process happening below the grid scale of the climate model. Every time step, no matter where you are, and it depends on nothing except for the time scale and the length scale of the climate model. These fluxes are also massive. So we have a huge storm of mixing, a tempest, that happens below the grid scale. Every climate model looks like it's not doing anything very interesting. So that's this. Here's your grid scale. And instead of this cascade, in a model, you would have this kind of cascade. But you have this implied massive amount of energy. It's just at the grid scale, it doesn't go anywhere else. It should have impacts on the result physics. And so we've gone through some lengths to try and calculate this. This is just some preliminary work, which is looking at the flux of ocean variance at the grid scale and comparing it to resolved fluxes. So there's a diffusive flux, which is how variance, lateral differences in temperature forcing are taken out from the model. And that might be larger in particular months, but this sort of subgrid scale, the spontaneous amount of variance production can be quite large, especially towards the end of the year. So periods when you have large amounts of sea ice loss also have massive amounts of input at the grid scale of temperature or salinity variance that can't be compensated by other resolved features. So that's a lot about what's going wrong. What are we doing to fix it? And this is work that is largely related to members of my group. So this is what we do in SASIP. We know there's a problem We can talk till we're blue in the face about what the problem is, but the group of us together and everyone else in this project is trying to build something better. And so in my group, like I mentioned before, we're focusing on ice-ocean interactions, things like waves. I'll just kind of buzz through a couple things, just in the interest of time. One thing we've been spending a lot of time on is looking at waves in the ice from space. So this is an example of the ICET-2 altimeter. It's a laser altimeter in space. It measures the surface height of sea ice. That's sea ice in the Barents Sea. It has this typical heights of 10 or 20 centimeters above the sea level. And this is an example section, just next to that one. A couple days later, after a large storm has passed through the Barents Sea, and you see the imprint of ocean surface wave type variability. And these waves, excuse me.
Where are you measuring those waves? Is this at the ice edge, or is it?
No, so here, these are the two examples. It's hard to see what they are. We're probably about 100, 200 kilometers inside the ice edge in this case.
So it's when it's fully solid,
Yep.
and you're detecting migrations at that height.
Oh yeah, and it's a lot more interesting in the southern hemisphere. So you can measure these kind of not quite this high amplitude variations in the surface height, but you can measure small variations on the ice shelf. So you can put seismic stations on the Ross ice shelf and measure long swell waves that are propagating from several thousand kilometers away. Yeah, if you look at these kind of tracks as they go into the sea ice and you match them up against optical imagery or passive microwave imagery, you can see that the waves are extending 100 or 200 kilometers into the ice pack. Everywhere, basically all the time. Not always in the Arctic, but certainly in the Southern Ocean. So just as an example, here's a track that's somewhere in the Southern Ocean. My postdoc, Mo Mahal, has been working on this kind of thing. And being able to actually subtract or remove the signature of these waves deep into the ice. So this is all under compact sea ice. Here we're looking at 50 kilometers into the ice. This is an example, another track that's 150 kilometers into the ice. This is more of a cartoon, but basically you find these things in a lot of places, and you can actually use a bunch of nifty math to separate out both the spectral composition of the waves using a generalized Fourier transform technique, but also by leveraging the fact that these have multiple beams, you can exploit the cross-beam coherence and get directional spectra. So what Moma's done is really fascinating. By looking at multiple different beams in the ICET-2, from the ICET-2 altimeter, and looking at the coherence between them, you can actually get both the direction and the amplitude and the spectrum of these waves as they move through ice. And what I think is the best part is that we developed this, Moma developed this, inside sea ice, which is way harder than doing it in the ocean. But you can do it in the ocean too, so it might be an easier problem. Another piece of work ongoing in my group is looking at how these variability in the ocean can impact sea ice. So rather than looking at how sea ice forces the ocean, look at feedbacks. And we've been doing this using a discrete element model called FlowDean. This is led by Sam Brenner. It's facing top right. So here is an eddy field generated by the sea ice edge. And now you've got these small flows, they're not that small, kilometers or so, getting ejected into the eddy field and being pulled away from it. And Sam's been thinking quite a bit about how you might have these fronts of flow propagation and looking at how you can spread out both the sea ice signal but then the resultant signal in the ocean. And one thing he's also looking at is comparing the rotation rates of flows to the vorticity of the upper ocean and seeing whether or not you can track upper ocean spectra using remote sensing of flow variability. So the sea ice model also runs. So I work in the ice ocean part of this. So we're doing parameterization development and process model studies. There's a whole host of other people in this project who are doing direct model building and development. I just don't want to leave this talk without showing you what they've been doing. This is the sea ice model that's run in SASIP. So it's got these large fracture patterns that go across the Arctic. It melts in the summer. It's got scales that range from, in this case, probably a few kilometers to hundreds of kilometers in its fractal behavior. And it's got subgrid scale representation of ice-induced mixing and sea ice flow size distributions, all stuff that have been developed through this project or just slightly before. More interesting to us is that we've been doing coupled simulations with waves to directly compare them to our estimates of Southern Ocean waves and ice from Sept 2. And we've just gotten, like Guillaume Boutin, who's also a postdoc working with me, the first integrations of this model in the Southern Ocean. So I just thought I'd share that. He sent this to me yesterday. And it's pretty cool. So if you're curious about more about the sea ice model, there's a paper that was published just this year by Einar Olesen, who's a leader of work package 2, looking at the fractal characteristics of the model. This is called EBM, and comparing that to observations. So even just looking at that, eyeballing it, you can see it goes pretty well, and then comparing that to one of the better versions of the viscous plastic sea ice model, run at very, very high resolution. And the upshot of this is that the model we're developing gets these scale variant features extremely well, both in their temporal scaling and their spatial scaling. And I'll just skip that. And wrap up by saying sea ice is a cool thing that we're studying. There's a lot of issues with it. Climate models, we're trying to solve some of them. And we're doing that by looking at it as a fractured brittle material. And you can find information. That's the SASIP website. It's my website. If you're curious about more, I'll take questions in the next couple minutes. Thank you.
About the blooms under the ice, we cannot see them from remote sensing. You have to go there to see them.
Yeah, basically. So we have a project that we're working on now. So that ice set altimeter I was mentioning, it's green. So if you can get photons to reflect through the ocean, you might be able to see these chlorophyll. And so this was a pilot study done outside of the ice, so that you could see subsurface blooms from the ice set altimeter because it's a green laser. We're now trying to do that where the ice is by integrating over all of these different cracks and trying to find photons that kind of came through the cracks. It's a mess, but yeah, so there's no present remote sensing technique that you could use to see them directly, but potentially with this laser altimeter, you might, yeah.
So I didn't quite understand one of the graphics when you were looking at uniform sea ice in the models versus you have this sort of comparing against one flow, two flow, so on. So it was quite far back. Looking at, yeah, I think it was that one. Yeah. So perhaps I'm misunderstanding something here, but I would have thought that the uniform and one flow would be similar rather than, you know, it seems like it's flipped on the horizontal with lots of flows being closer to.
So to make this uniform, requires basically smearing out the sea ice at constant volume across the entire surface. So each grid cell in this GCM has a concentration of 40%.
Yeah.
There's always heat going in. Whereas for the one flow, there's areas of the center part of the flow that aren't getting heated because it's reflecting the sunlight. So everywhere you have uniform ice, you have constant heat forcing.
Okay.
It's not realistic. I agree with you. It should be segregated somehow. And that's kind of the point I'm making later on, that there's this continuum model thing where there's a flaw, which is that you have to mix these heats. But in this case, the uniform has lots of mixing ongoing at every grid cell that's unresolved. So you're probably right. I haven't thought about that. But this uniform thing should be either closer to the multiple flow experiments or further on the right.
Okay, no, I understand that. Thanks.
All right. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.